All right, fantastic. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name's Jacqueline on the HashiCorp team, and I will be your field marketing team member today, just helping with today's session and managing any chat or questions you have for the group today. I'm very excited that we are hosting a Boundary workshop with our system integrator partner Arctiq. And we're going to be talking specifically around modernizing privileged access management. And just for an intro with our partner Arctiq, Arctiq's a long-standing and trusted partner of HashiCorp, and as a systems integrator and leader in professional IT services, Arctiq helps organizations across North America to architect transformative, practical solutions built on world-class technologies and best practices. And they have decades of industry expertise in a customer-centric ethos to deliver exceptional value to clients across industries. And at least for the HashiCorp team, we're just ecstatic that they are here to deliver a session with us on HashiCorp Boundary. And so to kick off, we have a great lineup of speakers today. We're going to have Alex and Adam talk us through the modern PAM environment and a bit of an intro to Boundary. And then we also have Shazia and Nicole, who are going to talk about how EQ Bank is adopting Boundary to drive security and compliance within their environment. And then we will have Tim give us a more technical overview of Boundary, and we'll also close with a demo. So that's just our lineup of speakers and the agenda for today. So with that, Alex, I will pass off to you to get us started.
Okay, let's dive right in. Hi, everyone. So as specified, I'm Alex. I'm from Arctiq. I'm Principal Solutions Architect here, and I want to talk very briefly about modern PAM. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what are the challenges that we're seeing in the marketplace today? What are our clients telling us? And what are the solutions they're looking for? And I've broken this down into really four problems that we're facing. Because today, the threat environment is probably more dangerous than it ever has been to this point. And there's really a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that credential theft has actually become easier and more common than I think it ever was in the past. So you may have heard of, have I been pwned? Are my credentials leaked out there? Are they out in the marketplace? But what you may not know is that there are dark websites where people are trading millions of leaked username and password groups. And you may have employees who are reusing passwords, right? This is an extremely common use case. Credentials are floating all over the place. And even when your credentials aren't all over the place, it's becoming easier and easier to just impersonate people and steal their credentials. So credential leakage is a huge problem. Cloud estates are continuing to sprawl, right? At one point, you may have had a couple of servers in a data center. Now you've got hundreds of VMs all over the place. You have to deal with credentials across all of these machines. Network management across those is more difficult because suddenly you've got multi-cloud environments. And at the same time, just as your cloud environment is sort of sprawling out of control, so is your workforce. So, contractors have been a thing for decades now. Globally, even you've got contractors in Europe, you've got contractors in Latin America, but you used to have local users. They used to be able to sit at their desks, and you could consider them part of that security boundary, right? Their desktops would be included in your security boundary. But now everybody's working from home. And so now suddenly you're deploying laptops, you're giving people VDIs, you're deploying them to untrusted networks and untrusted machines. And so the security boundary has become so much more permeable. And finally, and this is not a new problem, VPNs have the leaky abstraction of a VPN has become more and more problematic over time. So the idea that we're going to just extend a salesperson's laptop or extend a contractor's machine into our security boundary, make it part of our virtual private network. At one time, maybe that was okay. But as now you may have thousands of employees who are logging in from all across the globe. You've got contractors. having all those people just become part of virtual private network isn't good enough anymore. That abstraction doesn't work. Now you don't have a network, you've just got a piece of Swiss cheese that's got a ton of holes everywhere, right? And so what we're seeing is when you put all these things together, you get a threat actor who comes in, who impersonates your CEO to one of your contractors in Eastern Europe. Maybe they don't speak English particularly well. They get a text message from somebody who says they're the CEO. They compromise that guy's laptop. And then when that guy's laptop is compromised, they're jumping into his VPN, and suddenly they've got access to the entire environment, and that's a disaster for you. So, what do our customers want? What are the solutions we're thinking about? Well, jump hosts and jump boxes, bastion hosts, super common, not really good enough. Today, I think there's really three core pieces that we're seeing and that we're suggesting to our clients, and that our clients are really asking for. They want three things. So the first thing is a solution to that problem, to that access management problem. It needs to be automated, right? As we have more and more servers, we have more and more credentials, rotating those credentials, gaining access to those servers, delivering those credentials, targeting those hosts, getting access to those hosts, it all needs to be automated. This needs to be done through configurations code. It needs to be done through infrastructure as code. We need as much automation as possible. It needs to be aware. It needs to be context aware. Somebody who's sitting in a lab in your office is probably not as much of a threat as somebody who's overseas, right? We need granular RBAC level control. We need access to those specific target systems. We need to monitor those at a very specific level, as granular as possible. And it needs to be auditable. Right? We need a solution that gives detailed visibility into user access, that integrates with SIEM tools. So we're shipping those logs out to our existing SOC so that we can monitor what users are logging into. We want to be able to record sessions. We want to be able to see after the fact what users have done when they've been taking actions, when they've been making changes. What have they done? So that our auditors, because all those of us who work with big companies know, auditing is only getting worse, right? Our auditors need to be able to demonstrate that not only can we say it's been done, but we can show that it's been accomplished. So how do we do that, Adam? What's the answer?
Well, I don't think there's ever one sort of like silver bullet in security, right? But we certainly do have a tool that sort of works on sort of, solving that access management piece. And maybe if you go to the next slide and maybe the slide after, I think it's good to maybe just as like an extension of sort of what Alex was talking about there, talking a bit about sort of like where we've sort of come as an industry or where we've sort of been, and then, maybe talking a bit about sort of our solution boundary and some of the goals that we're trying to achieve at sort of a high level, right? So I think traditionally, most organizations sort of take that castle and moat approach where it's like everything internal inside the organization within the four walls of my data center or my organization is trusted. Everything outside is not, right? So typically you have sort of like a single ingress or egress VPN, right? Or maybe you have sort of like a NAT gateway or a WAN link, and you're basically having that notion of everything in is trusted, everything outside is trusted. We see very quickly that breaks down when we start thinking about the cloud operating model and cloud services, and so on and so forth, right? So maybe that worked for that sort of, on-prem sort of enterprise world once upon a time, but things have shifted, right? So maybe talking through sort of that workflow, right? For a user today, right? I'm looking to gain access to some sort of application, right? So sort of at the far end of that diagram. And, I need credentials to access that service. Maybe I'm using SSO to access that service, right? So typically the workflow, right, for that user, I need to request access to a VPN. Because let's just say I'm a remote worker. Maybe this service exists on AWS or some other sort of cloud service. I need to request access to a VPN so that way I can actually get on the network to do my job, right? So I'll request access, and then there's some administrator somewhere within the organization who's going to provision my certificate or maybe my basic auth, right? My username and password. They're going to give that to me as a user. Fantastic. Now I'm connected to the VPN. And typically from there, maybe it's a DMZ, but you have access to pretty much all the resources that are within that network, right? If it's segmented, that's wonderful, right? That it's not a flat network, but perhaps it's segmented. I still have access to all the resources there, even if I don't need those to do my job, right? Okay, let's just say that this resource, this application is further, deeper into my network, right? That's typically where like a jump box or like a bastion host, or maybe even another VPN sort of comes into play, right? So I'll request access to that bastion host, and usually there's some administrator who's more than happy to provision SSH key pair for me, right? So they're going to put that on the key host file on the bastion, right? And they're going to grant me access. Fantastic. I'm connected to that bastion. Maybe it's multiple hops, right? It's deeper into the network. Maybe it's a PCI sort of enclave or something of the sort, right? So I'm going to get provisioned to that bastion as well. They're going to add that key to the key host file. Wonderful. I'm going to take as many hops as I need to finally get to the network that has that application that I want to access. And from there, I'll check out the credentials that I need. If we're using SSO, that's wonderful. But let's just say that, I'm needing credentials for this application. Hopefully that's stored in one password or some other sort of like vault, right? And it's not in sort of like, an Excel spreadsheet or something of the sort, right? But I'm going to grab those credentials, and then finally I'm authenticated to the service, right? And I think really where we see that breaking down is that, once again, as I alluded to earlier, when I'm hopping on that VPN or even the bastion, I have access to every single resource that's within that network, right? I may not have credentials, but I'm able to sort of see that that machine, right? Like I can ping it, I can potentially access it, even if that's not required for my job, right? And I think also sort of like those firewall-based rules, it's fantastic if you can sort of like segment out the network. But once again, it sort of requires your organization to be sort of perfect, constantly sort of like updating sort of that IP list. If you're on AWS using like a security group, for instance, to say, okay, they can only access these resources from these IP addresses. What if those IPs change, especially in sort of the cloud operating model? That's bound to happen, right? And then sort of connecting to that bastion host, I'm maintaining this sort of large list of key pairs. Who are they tied to? Are they still relevant? It's very difficult to tell when you look at a key host file, right? Like which user sort of that belongs to. And also, when you think about onboarding and offboarding, I'm doing this for hundreds of users potentially, or maybe even thousands of users. It requires your security team to be perfect, to make sure that when a user leaves an organization, as an example, when a person leaves an organization, you're deprovisioning their access sort of across the board, right? Are you doing that in your bastions? Are you doing that, for your VPN? Are you doing that for your applications? That sort of becomes the question, right? So I think that's where we talk a bit about sort of at least our take on Boundary. So if you go to the next slide. And this is where we sort of talk about Boundary's value proposition as sort of like a single pane of glass. And the thing that we really talk about a lot is sort of identity-based access. So based on the user's identity, right? So, Boundary integrates with your sort of OIDC provider. So let's just say you're using Azure, now it's Entra ID, but Active Directory, right? As an example, based on the group memberships that those users are a part of, Boundary will actually provision access to specific resources, right? So it's tied to sort of that user's identity, their membership, and it sort of becomes a single pane of glass instead of having to maintain access and usernames and passwords sort of across multiple different resources, right? So when you go to deprovision a user, deprovision them in AD, you don't have to do that sort of across all those different services, right? As sort of one example. And we sort of think of it also as sort of like a jump box replacement to some degree, right? So just going through that flow and maybe talking through sort of that initial piece again, right? So first, a user, typically will log in with their identity provider, whether that's Okta, Active Directory, GitHub, so on and so forth, right? So we'll integrate or we'll authenticate those users based on those group memberships. We'll sort of provision access to particular resources, right? So we call those targets within Boundary, right? And as an administrator, right, I can sort of bring those targets, those resources under management, whether I'm using AWS, whether I'm using Azure, or whether I have sort of, an on-prem environment. I can use that. I can do that using something called dynamic host catalogs, right? To basically sort of see, okay, based on the tag of a resource on AWS or Azure, bring that under management. Or maybe I have sort of some static hosts on premises. I'll sort of add a static host catalog and sort of add the required information, the IP address, the service, so on and so forth, right? And when a user actually is authorized to access that particular resource, right? It could be any TCP-based resource. They'll basically use Boundary as a single pane of glass to connect to their target, right? And in Boundary, we have a desktop client, right? That's available sort of across operating systems, whether that's Mac OS, Windows, and Linux, right? We also, of course, have a CLI tool. And yeah, so, if someone wants to SSH, as an example, to some service on AWS, they want to break the glass into staging or production, you can grant them access, make sure that they have sort of their group membership as required. From there, they'll authenticate the boundary, and then they'll be able to sort of establish that session. And then really the goal with Boundary as well is to provide that audit trail, right? So we have sort of features like session recording, for instance, that allow you to sort of play back exactly what happened in a particular session. And of course, we have audit logs, right? So we're able to see which user established what sessions to what targets, right? How long were those sessions? What were the bytes up, bytes down? So on and so forth, right? That's information that we can sort of send over to our SIEM, and we can basically have that audit trail of access. Whereas with bastions, right, it can be fairly opaque, right? In terms of like, okay, who accessed the bastion? What were they doing? What resources did they access, right? So on and so forth. So that's sort of a bit about Boundary, right? And we also have a native integration with Vault, right? For folks who may be aware, HashiCorp Vault, right? Sort of secrets management at scale. We're able to sort of integrate with Vault as our credential provider. We also have sort of a static credential store as well. And that basically will allow you to sort of broker per session credentials just in time, right? So when a user establishes a session to a particular target, if we're not using SSO, to sort of take that example earlier, let's just say I'm using basic auth, I can broker those credentials to that user just in time, and they can use those credentials. Once their session, let's just say, reaches that limit of 6 hours, their session is terminated. They no longer have access to that particular target, right? So that's sort of the story there with Boundary, and maybe go over to the next slide. So yeah, really our vision for Boundary is to enable sort of the ephemeral access model, right? So users authenticate to Boundary using their identity provider of choice, right? They're tightly authorized to perform actions on a dynamic set of targets. Those can be dynamic, those can be static as well, right? And that's any TCP-based service. And then they can be granted just-in-time access to those targets, and they're getting the credentials that they need from Vault to do the job that they need. And like I said, we'll also have a demo sort of at the end, sort of showing what that workflow looks like. With something that maybe some folks may have heard of at HashiDay's transparent sessions. We'll get into that. Next slide. So yeah, so at a super high level, because the question you may be wondering is like, okay, great. You're sort of brokering TCP sessions. Is this an agent-based model? Is this sort of a proxy-based model? So Boundary is a proxy-based solution, right? So we have a control plane and we have a data plane. So the control plane essentially assigns jobs at the super high level, right? Assigns jobs to our workers. And those workers, we think of them as sort of intelligent bastion hosts, right? So instead of a user having to explicitly sort of connect to each bastion, along the way and have those SSH keys provisioned for them, Boundary will actually assign jobs to those workers, and those workers are essentially TCP proxies. So when a user is connecting to Boundary, they're essentially just getting access through that worker to that target system without ever having to actually be on the network that target system resides in, right? And when it comes to things like credential brokering or even credential injection, that's a feature where it's available for SSH today, where essentially we'll actually check out the credentials from a credential store like Vault, and then we'll essentially provide what feels like a passwordless experience to the user. It's not passwordless for the system in the sense that we're taking, let's just say, that username and password or that SSH certificate, and we're actually providing that to the worker. And then the worker is providing that to the target system on behalf of the user. So if the user is authorized to access that resource, they try to connect. From there, we'll actually just sort of authenticate them on their behalf because they're already authorized to the target system. So yeah, that's a bit about Boundary at sort of a high level, and you can go over to the next slide. Yeah, so some of the key features, right? So that passwordless authentication, I think that speaks to sort of like credential injection, as well as sort of credential brokering. And also when it comes to sort of like integrating with your OIDC provider, right? Sort of having that single sign-on experience and ensuring that, based on sort of the user's membership to particular groups, let's provision them access to particular resources. And then of course, let's have that granular visibility, what actions we're taking on that remote system. That's something that's available today for SSH, like I said, session recording, and sort of that audit trail that's available for any action that's taken across Boundary, right? And then the automated host discovery. If you go back real quick, sorry, Jacqueline, the automated host discovery is also sort of a big piece, right? And we sort of see that as a differentiator in terms of, great, based on sort of the tags of particular resources, let's bring those under management. So if you have, let's just say EC2 instances out on AWS as an example, you can use a dynamic host catalog to, like as resources are provisioned on AWS, bring those into Boundary, and then based on group memberships, let's actually give users access to those resources just in time. So yeah, that's a bit about Boundary. Jacqueline, I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Alex and Adam, for all that information on Boundary. And we're going to move on to the next portion of today's session, where we are going to talk about one of an instance where we have a EQ bank that is using Boundary in their environment. And Shazia, if you want to take this forward and kick off with Nicole, I'll pass it off to you both.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline. Hey, everyone. I'm excited for us to chat with Nicole Landry from EQ Bank. She serves as the Director of Identity and Access Management, and EQ Bank has been a Boundary customer for a little over a year. Nicole, it's so good to have you. To start off our discussion, we'd love to learn, what specific controls drove the choice of Boundary for EQ Bank.
Certainly. So hi, everyone. So when we started looking at our privileged access management journey, a lot of what drives, at least from the industry that EQ Bank is in, which is the financial industry, is there's a lot of regulatory requirements and there's a lot of findings, controls, and privileged access management is not necessarily a buzzword anymore, but it's something that we needed to work towards. Which was really the key driver behind our selection process and starting to assess certain privileged access management solutions, as well as looking for something that also was more of a modern PAM solution and additionally that does secrets management as well. So some of that is really the key drivers as to or the reasons behind our decision and working towards sort of building out our privileged access management strategy and journey here.
Well, that is great to hear. Curious, what use cases, are we as Boundary helping to solve for?
So right now, I would say, for most, if you're familiar with any sort of PAM journey, it is a journey. So right now, we were looking at privileged session management, the auditing and the recording aspects, as also we wanted to eliminate admin passwords. So what kind of helped us get to that authentication authorization piece of it, in which Boundary sort of supported, and additionally provide sort of dynamic authorized access and sort of further scaling for our cloud. And I would say also, eliminating the pathways, the network pathways to serve to servers actually, and only going through Boundary. So those were a lot of the use cases that are solved today, but we still have others I think we recently learned of some new features that we're looking to put into our scopes for future planning and future roadmaps. So those are the kind of plans for, continuing.
Yeah, something we hear a lot about is the user experience that Boundary provides. Can you share more about the user experience that you've kind of experienced, I guess, with Boundary and you know, your team?
So I'll speak from it from the lens of obviously rolling this out, right? And a change can always kind of have some, you know, positives and negatives. But the most of the outcome or sort of the feedback we've got from rolling this out here has been very positive. It's been sort of simplifying a lot for our end users that are generally using it on a day-to-day basis. But also meeting those security concerns on our end. So, you know, working with our key stakeholders that are really the users. So I'm not necessarily the key user, but it's been fairly positive.
Yeah, we hear a lot about that, which is wonderful. And then one last question that we have for you is currently, how do people onboard their resources within the EQ Bank team?
So for us, we have dedicated teams, you know, split out roles and responsibilities. So as I mentioned, we're still on our PAM journey and working through that. And we've decided our scope of what that onboarding looks like. And as we continue to sort of move through that, we are defining sort of the onboarding for our service or what we're providing from a PAM perspective. And then those sort of go through a request. So it really depends on sort of operationalizing it within your organizations and what that looks like from an onboarding perspective. And for us, we just have dedicated teams that are working through it, and then future scope that sort of dictates what next gets onboarded.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. This has been super helpful. I'd like to turn it over to Tim at Arctiq for a technical review of the Boundary environment.
Okay. Hi. So, from an infrastructure perspective, this diagram kind of depicts what a typical Boundary deployment will look like. For starters, the Boundary will need a database. The database is where it stores all of its state and configuration. Right now, the only supported database is PostgreSQL. I think version 12 and up will be sufficient. And then you'll need a KMS. A KMS serves a number of functions that Boundary requires. And right now, the supported KMSs are all the cloud KMSs and Vault's transit secrets engine. Then there's the Boundary control plane. This is, I guess, the meat of the product. This is this can be deployed on VMs or on Kubernetes. You can have multiple copies of the Boundary control plane, typically load balanced. The Boundary control plane will serve the API and the web UI. And this is where you configure Boundary, where the integrations with Vault and your identity provider happen. Then there are the workers. The workers are the devices that actually perform the proxying of the connections between the clients and the target systems. At the very least, you're going to need a single ingress worker. An ingress worker is a worker that is able to accept inbound connections from Boundary clients. So it'll have to be reachable from all of your clients. Now, after connecting through an ingress worker, a connection could be made directly to the target hosts from the ingress worker. But in some situations, your target hosts are going to be in some very restricted networks that don't necessarily permit inbound connections from other networks. And to solve for that, there are egress workers. And what an egress worker is, it's a worker that establishes outbound connections to ingress workers. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to poke a hole in your firewall to allow an inbound connection from the outside to the egress worker. The egress worker will establish connection to an ingress worker and create an encrypted tunnel that will facilitate the connection from the client through the ingress worker, then through the egress worker to your target hosts. Next, Jacqueline. Once you've initialized and logged into Boundary, you'll be presented with a lot of configuration options. First, you'll see the global scope object. Now, a scope in a Boundary is essentially a logical container that contains all the other objects that you use to configure the behavior of Boundary. The global scope object is created when you initialize Boundary, and it cannot be deleted, and there can only be one. The global scope object can have any number of child scope objects, and scope objects that are children of the global scope object are called organizations. And what's typically done with an organization is you have an organization for every business unit in your organization. This is where you typically configure your authentication method, your integration with your IDP. This can be either OIDC, LDAP, or username and password, which is the internal authentication mechanism. There are also, this is where you will also configure users and groups. Users and groups could be, or I guess, internal representations of what are potentially users and groups represented in your external IDP. Or if you're using username and password, then they are the actual, users and groups from your the internal IDP, if you will. Then you'll configure roles. A role is a set of permissions that will be assigned to a user and group, and these permissions govern what the principal will be allowed to perform, the actions that the principal will be allowed to perform, and the resources that they'll have access to. Then there's a project. A project is another scope object. Projects are child objects of the organization scope objects, and this is the lowest level of scope object. And this is it's optional, so you don't actually have to use a project, but it's useful for organizing targets and hosts. So that's what a project is. Now, inside a project or an organization, you're going to configure targets and hosts. A target is, at the end of the day, just a TCP port. So the combination of a target and a host is what you'll ultimately be connecting to. A host is what it sounds like. It's a host is a member of a host catalog. And a host catalog could be either static or dynamic. Static being, of course, where you have to specify each host statically. But dynamic host catalogs allow you to configure Boundary to reach out to your cloud providers and discover hosts that you might want to allow your clients access to. And finally, there's the credential stores. This is where integrations with Vault come in, if you're going to integrate with Vault. Credential stores are a way to store or give users access to credentials that they can use to access hosts. And finally, there's the Boundary desktop application. This is the little piece of software that you would install on your end users' desktops or laptops that will allow them to authenticate the boundary and ultimately connect to their target hosts. Next slide, please. So what happens when you actually connect to log into a boundary and connect? First, you'll need a boundary client, and you'll have to first authenticate to boundary. This is done, the boundary client will connect to the boundary controller, and authentication could potentially involve interactions with your external IDP or internally with the boundary controller. Once you're authenticated to boundary, based on the roles that you've been assigned, you'll be presented with a set of hosts, targets and hosts that you can connect to. When you go to connect to a target, what will happen is that the boundary client will, there will be some coordination between the controller, the boundary client, and the worker. And the boundary client will establish a connection to a boundary worker. And at the same time, the boundary client will start listening on the loopback interface of the laptop or desktop where it's installed. This it'll be listening on a randomly chosen port, and this is the port where you're going to use your protocol client to connect to. So if you want to connect to a MySQL client, or sorry, a MySQL server, then when you hit connect on Boundary, Boundary will establish a connection to a worker and listen on the loopback interface, and it will potentially also display a set of credentials if you've configured a credential store or an integration with Vault. If you've configured an integration with Vault, then these credentials can be dynamically generated at the time of connection. But once this connection has been established between the boundary client and the worker, what you'll have to do is you'll have to start your MySQL client, and you'll have to direct it to the port where the boundary client is listening. And you'll supply your credentials, and when your MySQL client connects, it will connect to the boundary client, which will then forward the connection over the worker to the target on the private network. And that's how Boundary facilitates connectivity to private resources. Now I'll throw it over to Adam, who has a demo prepared that'll show you Boundary in action. Adam?
Yeah, awesome. And Kuldeep, I'm chatting with a couple of folks, just individually, just asking some questions, or answering some questions rather. I'll get to your question in a second. But yeah, so I'll maybe just walk through two demos here. I'll just share my screen. Alrighty, so two demos, and it sort of talks through what Tim was talking about sort of the desktop client and sort of that end user experience for folks. So this is just sort of like, just a proof of concept demo. So, you basically have the Boundary desktop client here, right? As I mentioned before, there's a desktop client available for Mac, Windows, as well as Linux, right? This is typically the way that end users access their machines, right? I think for more technical users, using the Boundary CLI totally works as well. Typically accessing your resources via the CLI looks like typing in Boundary Connect, and then let's just say typing in SSH. So we have some helper commands: Boundary Connect SSH alias, right? So the alias for a particular resource, the name of it, right? Or Boundary Connect RDP, right? As an example, or Postgres, right? But talking through the desktop client here, you can see, okay, I have a sign-in page. There's a cluster URL, so that's for my controller, right? And then there are a couple of different authentication methods, right? We're just going to be using the basic sort of like password authentication method, nothing fancy here. But if you were using OIDC, right, you would sort of get that prompt it would take you to a browser and then you'd sort of authenticate. Boom, you're authenticated in Boundary as well. But we'll just sort of use password auth method here. All right, so wonderful. I'm presented with a target screen here. So I have all of my different targets. In this case, I just have two, right? I have a production Postgres database, and then I also have a web server that I'm allowed to SSH to, right? So it's a web server, but I have sort of the SSH port defined for that particular resource, right? So over port 22. What I can do here as an end user, I can search for sort of active sessions. I can search based on sort of like the type of target or the scope that it's sort of a part of. And I think Tim was sort of talking a bit about that as well. But I'll just search for SSH here. Now I'll mistype it, right? And I'll get my sort of web server. I'll click connect. And this is where, like Tim was sort of mentioning, this is typically where I'd get some pretty interesting sort of information about that target, right? So if there were brokered credentials, and we'll see that in sort of the next demo, if there were brokered credentials, I'd see those here. I have some target details, right, about that particular target and that resource. The IP address that it's sort of located at. For this demo, just sort of have a SSH server set up locally, right? So that's why the loopback is there, right? And I can essentially copy that ephemeral port that I would use to essentially reverse proxy over to that worker and get my connection established. Or I could click, let's just say like the shell here, because I'm using SSH. We actually have a built-in terminal that folks can use. So that way Boundary sort of becomes that single pane of glass, right? So in this case, I'll go over, grab that SSH helper command, right? So I can use the sort of ephemeral port, loop back, just copy those individually, or just grab that helper command. Go over to the SSH, great. Got my little embedded terminal here. I'll put in my username. I didn't get any brokered credentials. We're not doing credential injection, nothing fancy. And I'm authenticated, right? And I have access to my target resource. Wonderful. And in that scenario, I just sort of ended the session directly. So you can see Boundary Desktop becomes sort of that single pane of glass, right? If you're using something sort of behind the scenes, like let's just say ServiceNow for like approvals, that's something that you could do sort of as a third-party integration. It's not something that we support natively within Boundary, right? But you would essentially have some sort of third-party process to say, how am I sort of defining what resources my users should get access to? How do they request access to different hosts or services on my network? You could probably do that via third-party integration like ServiceNow, and we do have a blog on that. For the next demo, this was something that was teased at HashiDays. And this does sort of fundamentally change the user experience. And this is something that we've been investing heavily in this past year and will continue to do so because we think that's something that differentiates us from a lot of our competitors, right? So transparent sessions, maybe just talking about it a bit of a high level. A lot of its functionality is predicated on sort of having what we call a Boundary client agent. So essentially that is it's a Boundary client that is installed on the user's machine, and it's actually a DNS client, right? So it'll be set as your primary resolver, and it's essentially looking to see if there are any what we call aliases that match within Boundary, if there are any aliases that match any of the DNS names, any of the fully qualified domain names that you've been hitting as you sort of just go about your day, browsing the internet, accessing infrastructure, so on and so forth, right? If there is a match, great. With transparent sessions, we'll actually just proxy sort of that session. We'll establish that session on behalf of the user, and they get that transparent proxy almost, right? That transparent sort of session. If there isn't a match, then we'll just recurse to whatever that previous DNS resolver was, and it'll just, just like how DNS works, it'll keep going down the list until it sort of finds an answer for that particular request, right? So there are a couple of assumptions here, and that we're authenticated to Boundary, right, in our desktop client. In this case, I actually do have credentials associated with this target that I'm connecting to. And yeah, the client agent is installed on my machine as well, right? So I'm going to go into the terminal here, and I'm just going to SSH, right? So I already know my username, and I'm using a pretty well-known sort of endpoint, sdf.org, for folks who may not be aware, right? It's just sort of like an SSH service that's been running since like the 90s, right? So it's a public endpoint, great for demos, right? So I have that actually set as an alias. I have tty.sdf.org set. And from there, right, Boundary actually gives me a little notification that says, hey, you've been connected to this particular resource, right? So instead of sort of having to explicitly click connect in Boundary Desktop or do Boundary Connect via the CLI, I'll just transparently sort of access my resource, maybe use desktop client as a single pane of glass to find my resource, right? But in this case, I already knew that I had this as an alias. Get that notification, I'll click it. Then I'll actually be taken back to the desktop client. This is an example where we actually have a session that has brokered credentials, like I mentioned. So we can see the credentials here, right? I could sort of uncheck the visibility there, so that way I could actually see those creds. I can also view the API output if that's something that's of interest to me, right? If it's like a JSON blob as an example, or a secure note. And I can just sort of copy to clipboard, right? So I'll just copy the password there. I'll input that in, and wonderful, I'm on SDF, right? And if I go back to the sessions page, I'll see that I have an active session, right? And this is sort of, also how it looks today within Boundary when you establish a session. And we do have sort of those controls for the end user as well as for the admin, where, of course, as an admin, you'll be able to see sort of session recordings after a session has sort of transpired. You have sort of the audit logs as well. You can also cancel a session, right? If, let's just say, something malicious is sort of happening for a particular session, you have the ability within the admin UI to just cancel that session. And of course, as an end user, I can just cancel that explicitly within the desktop client. And you'll sort of see that here. My connection's closed, and I close out of my SSH session. So that was a bit about sort of the end user experience sort of today within Boundary with a desktop client, and sort of like where we're going with it. Sort of a sneak peek for the folks here on the webinar. Happy to chat more about it, of course, after the webinar. But yeah, thanks everyone.